Hello. To begin our study of statistical analysis for research, design, and methods, we're going to be talking about data types, specifically quantitative and categorical data. This isn't to be confused with study design, quantitative and qualitative studies. Remember, qualitative studies are those that are conducted through interviews and such, and quantitative are those that gather specific data points. At this point, we're focusing on quantitative studies, where data is gathered. However, the data may take on a variety of forms, as we will see throughout this video. So let's talk for a second about why we collect data in the first place. Well, because the world is full of variation, and we're trying to make sense of it. If every outcome was exactly the same, we probably wouldn't have statistical analysis in the first place. So one question it makes sense to ask ourselves are, what are data? Data are information that we collect about subjects. Sometimes we refer to subjects as experimental units. And as we know, our experimental units or our subjects are not always human. It could be anything that we're gathering data from, but we'll use the term subjects and experimental units interchangeably. So it's important that for any piece of information that we gather, that we have some context. So for context, we'll sometimes refer to these as the W's, which you might recognize as the who, what, when, where, why, and we'll add to that how. Okay, so for example, Amazon gathers a lot of information about its users. So maybe their information they gather looks something like this. This looks like a mess. We've got countries, we have people, we have N. I don't know, does that stand for no? I don't know, I see a Y over here, so I guess yes or no. But without context for what this information is, we can't really explain what's going on here. So maybe we'll organize it in terms of a table that looks something like this. Now it starts to make more sense. We have our variable names listed here. Okay, and actually I see now that Y and that N makes a lot more sense. They're talking about, is this a gift? So when you check out, it'll ask, is this a gift? Yes or no? Then that tells them whether they need to wrap it or provide a card for you. Okay, so we can see that given the context of the information will help us understand and analyze the data a lot better. So as we mentioned in the first slide, there are a variety of types of variables. We have quantitative and we have categorical variables. On the quantitative side, even that is broken down into two different areas. For quantitative variables, we have what's called discrete quantitative variables and continuous. And for categorical variables, we have nominal versus ordinal. The next few slides will talk about the difference between the two. Let's begin with categorical variables. In general, what is a categorical variable? A variable that takes on one of a limited number of possible values, essentially assigning each subject, remember subject is the same as experimental unit, to a particular group or category. What does that mean? Well, essentially that means that the data that we're gathering is able to be put into a specific category. So maybe it's best to understand this through an example. Like eye color. When you gather information about eye color, the information that you gather is that either eye color is brown, blue, green, hazel. I mean, I guess we could go on for a while, but we're certainly not going to include red in our list unless we're not talking about humans. And again, that's where context really matters. Okay, but there's going to be a limited number of categories that each experimental unit or subject's going to fall into. You're not going to have a mix of the two. You're going to choose one of these categories to fall into. Same thing with political leanings. If I'm asking my subjects which political party they follow, there's only a limited number of possibilities there, and then we'll categorize the people using those. So even within a categorical variable, there are two different types. The first that we will talk about is nominal. Nominal categorical variables have levels with arbitrary names. The name is simply assigned to it, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything as opposed to how it relates to the other. So for example, when we talked about eye color earlier. So for eye color, we're going to list blue, brown, green, We'll start with those. That wouldn't be really any different than if I listed them in this order: green, blue, brown. They are distinct outcomes, and they simply just are given those names. Okay, so that's different than what we would call ordinal. So ordinal, notice the word order might be in there. It has at least 3 levels, and every reasonable person would place those levels in the same or exact reverse place. So order somewhat plays a role here. So let's look at an example. You deal with exam grades all the time. Now, you might have grades that are based on a numerical scale, but we also sometimes assign grades A, B, C. And again, that's categorical. The labels are not numerical, but every reasonable person would say that an A is higher than a B is higher than a C, because these are representative of different outcomes. Same thing with burn severity. So if you have a first degree versus a third degree burn, we would know that the first degree burn is more severe than a third degree burn. So even though these are categorical and numerically the 1, 2, and 3 don't necessarily stand for anything quantitative, they do put you in a category where this category of first degree burn is more severe than, say, the category of third degree burn. So let's move on to quantitative variables. What's the definition of quantitative variables? Variables that result in recorded numbers that encode size information based on a quantitative scale. Again, what's an easier way to say this? Well, let's look at some examples. First example that we might look at is height. So if you can measure somebody's height and get a number. How about number of sandwiches eaten in a week? I can measure that. I will get a number. Okay, maybe I ate 15 sandwiches this week, maybe I ate 1, and those numbers mean something. So instead of strictly putting an outcome into a category, I'm able to actually get information specifically that is numerical in nature. As with categorical variables, there are 2 types of quantitative variables. So let's take a look at the first type. A discrete quantitative variable has finite values that fall into buckets. Well, what exactly does that mean? Let's look at an example. Let's think about shoe size. When you go to the shoe store, you may say that you have a size 10 shoe. Are you going to go in and say that you have a size 10.362 shoe? No, because that's not going to be something that they are going to have in stock, right? But that doesn't make this any less numeric of an outcome. So while this is a quantitative value, there are only a finite number of outcomes that you could have. So for the shoe example, your finite outcomes are maybe size 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, right? And they're going to stop at some point, but you're not going to have an infinite number of outcomes in between those. Okay, so let's take a look at the alternative, which is a continuous quantitative variable. These technically do have an infinite number of outcomes or steps or values. So what's a quantitative variable that might be measured this way? How about height? So when I measure my height, my height can be measured as specifically as I'd like, and I could have infinitely many outcomes. Okay, so I may be 5 feet 6 inches tall, but I could also be 5 feet 6.2 inches tall, right? And I could keep getting more specific from there. And it depends on the precision of my measuring instrument. Okay, so I don't necessarily have to report all those infinite numbers of outcomes as a possibility because it's hard to be that precise with certain things, but that possibility is there. In these final couple of slides, we're going to talk not specifically about quantitative or categorical variables, but numbers of variables. So we have an option. We can study one variable, which is called univariate analysis, or bivariate analysis, which is studying 2 variables. So in univariate analysis, I'm just gathering information on one variable. So for one variable for every experimental unit. So maybe I just want to know for every experimental unit, let's go to an earlier example, what's their shoe size? I could do this quantitatively, categorically, whatever, but it's just how many variables you're gathering. I could also do the bivariate analysis, which deals with specifically two variables collected for each experimental unit. So for subject 1, I might gather information about their shoe size, but I might also gather information about their height. I might also gather information about what they like to read. Really, whatever I want. But the important part is that for every experimental unit, I'm gathering all of these pieces of information. For experimental unit 2, gathering all these pieces of information. Okay, so what I've written here isn't simply bivariate. That would be just if I did shoe size and height. I added a third one on there. At that point, it becomes what's called multivariate. And throughout the remainder of our statistical analysis assignments, we're going to be dealing with both univariate analysis and bivariate analysis. Okay, so finally, we want to ask the question, I don't know, which of these is best? Which is it best to collect categorical or quantitative? Or is it better to have one variable in univariate analysis or do a bivariate analysis? Well, that's not really the question. So data analysis is really driven by the question that you're trying to answer. So depending on what I know, I'm going to make choice about what kinds of variables to gather. The important part about learning statistics is that you know what your possibilities are. So just know this, that if you choose to gather, or if your question has you gathering categorical data, you will design tests or statistical tests that are meant to test specifically categorical data. Those statistical tests will be different than what you would use to analyze quantitative data. Okay, but it's really the question that's going to drive what kind of data that you end up gathering. Okay, so that's it for this one. Moving on, we're going to be studying those different types of analysis and how we can look at our variables.